You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to episode 64 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Pacetta, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. Connect with us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or swing by our website, socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today is the first three-way episode of the podcast with Drs. Dan Mercea and Sean Walker. So Dr. Dan Mercea is a senior lecturer in sociology at City University of London and also associate editor for the academic journal Information, Communication, and Society, which is one of the premier journals in our field focusing on digital and social media. And Dr. Mercea's work, in addition to what we talked about last episode on Brexit botnets, focuses a lot on protest movements and how social media is used in protest movements. But what we're going to be talking about today is this idea of transnational serial activists who are people who use social media, particularly Twitter, to help coordinate and create awareness about protest movements, even though they don't actually live in a particular country. So they sit at home and they help coordinate protests from over 40 different national contexts is the kind of threshold that Dr. Mercea has put it at. Dr. Sean Walker, meanwhile, is an assistant professor in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences in the New College at Arizona State University. And Dr. Walker has done a lot of work focusing on digital media in the Occupy Wall Street movement. And he also has a great interest in the challenges of collecting, analyzing, and archiving social media data. So the reason that we're all here together in Copenhagen is Information, Communication, and Society hosted a conference focused on being locked out of social platforms. So as social media platforms continue to take steps to limit researchers' access to data in response to things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, researchers are really at an inflection point here, thinking about how do we move forward in analyzing social media. And I think it's been a good conference to really kind of sit and reflect about kind of what is the research we have done, are doing, and where do we want to take it in the future in response to the challenges and limitations posed by platforms in terms of accessing data. So after the conference, both Dr. Mercea and Dr. Walker stopped by the studio, and we have kind of an open conversation about what is the state right now of social media research and studying political processes. And then we also dig a bit into how digital media has been used in Occupy and protests around the world, and what are some of the ways that we can continue to study these phenomenon in this locked out environment that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to go ahead and cut right to that conversation. My guests, again, are Dr. Dan Mercea from City University of London and Dr. Sean Walker from Arizona State. Dr. Mercea, Dr. Walker, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So, Dr. Mercea, why don't we start with you, as you're the associate editor of Information, Communication, and Society, and we're all here together as a result of a conference that was called Locked Out of Social Platforms. So I'm curious if you can go into a bit about the theme of that conference and why you decided to focus on particularly researchers' access to data in this quote-unquote post-API era.
Thanks for the question, Michael. So I suppose the main motivation has been to pause and think about what's been happening in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and to look more closely at the way in which we as researchers have been using social media APIs to reflect critically on the kind of, the habit that we've developed, and also to think about the fact that this access that we've had, although we knew there were many problems with the scope of it, that has been limited to an extent now that it's impractical and unreliable to continue to use these APIs, the application program interfaces. So we wanted to kind of bring a community of people who are in the know or have an interest in this issue to think critically about where we are, how we can respond to this issue given our interest in social interaction broadly, and the way in which these platforms, so we're talking Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms, Instagram and so on, how these platforms mediate our social interaction. And so I think it's at an inflection point, it's a crisis point, And it's something that actually has been in the making for some time now. So we are aware, for instance, of the fact that Facebook was, as they say, throttling the API way before Cambridge Analytica. So at the end of last year, 2017, they were already doing this. So this has been in the pipeline, and it has to do with the business model of these companies. But obviously, there are critical questions around, for instance, electoral campaigning, and how these platforms are weaponized, as we say these days, how they're used for political and for in strategic communication that is disruptive of some of these key processes in for instance, democratic countries. So what we wanted to do was to gather this community to reflect critically, to think about how we take our analysis forward, whether we need to have a response as a community of scholars, and how we continue to do our research in ways that informs the wider analysis, policy, and potentially other interests that people might have.
And Dr. Walker, let me ask you, because one of your research interests is all about the challenges in collecting, analyzing, archiving social media data. What's your take on this throttling down of APIs? I mean, there's always been challenges in sort of digital data research. So kind of what's the situation now as you see it?
Well, the sort of the situation now is social media companies basically sort of like irrigated this set of research, and now they've cut off the water in a way, which means the sort of data that we're used to having access to is gone. But that also points out some challenges that have been there the whole time, in that, looking at data from APIs is sort of like experiencing social media as part of the matrix, or like a early mud or moo, like this textual experience. But social media data is this multimodal data that has interfaces, it has URLs that extend the length of all these posts, it has interfaces and images. And so I think this highlights a lot of those existing problems of the way that we collect this data, and often the way that we study this data is completely divorced from how users actually use social media data. And then we also study this at an individual platform level. So that's not how we use social media. It's not just what's happening on Twitter. And that's because we've sort of been forced to go to these platforms that have the most accessible data, which is still pretty inaccessible. And that's why you have all these Twitter studies. But now that that's being cut off, we have to sort of think about alternatives. What can we actually learn? How do we integrate practices like web archiving? But then that pushes a lot of this research into more technical researchers. So as social science researchers have just begun to grasp what it means to collect data from APIs, now they have to learn something different.
Yeah, I can identify myself in that group. So I want to ask both of you, what are your main takeaways from this conference? I mean, we had a lot of great scholars getting together and discussing exactly, what to do, how to move forward. Throwing it out there to either of you, what did you learn, or what was something that was surprising for you in these past couple of days?
I'll quickly go first. So I guess that there's a long-term perspective and there's a short-term perspective. The short-term answer would be, how do we find workarounds, if you want, to the question of where do we go from here? So the workarounds are many. So there were some voices who basically said we need to wean ourselves off social media, API data, and find other modes of collecting data. That again speaks to the usage of social media. And so this is the kind of primary takeaway in response to the short-term issue of figuring out how we can keep this research going. The long-term response would be more political in nature. So it goes to the issue of the power that these platforms have in contemporary society, and how we can, as a community, respond in a way that informs the wider political policy debate about what the place of these platforms is in society, and what their responsibility is, how accountable they are politically, socially, and so on. And that's a more thorny question, primarily because it kind of interferes in the business model. It questions fundamentally the business model that they have in place at the minute. So I guess that the second issue is something that we're still mulling. And there was an open letter that was signed by the president of the Association of Internet Researchers, who spoke at our conference here in Copenhagen, and that open letter raised these concerns in a systematic way. And then we kind of also, because there were many junior academics, we kind of focus more on the short-term response.
Right. Dr. Walker?
And I would say that we brought in this conversation. Some of my earlier work, I've addressed this, that we need to be very reflexive about how social media platforms shape our work. And so basically the reason why we use likes and retweets and those sorts of metrics are because that's what the platforms feed us. So this gives us an opportunity to stop and pause and be more reflexive about what are we actually studying, and are these really good proxies for what we're trying to measure. And the other piece is that our memory institutions and our archival institutions are behind on this. They have very little idea about what to do with this data, and most of them are very scared and cautious institutions, and they are afraid to collect this data and store it because they don't want to get sued. And so that means there's this sort of gray market that we don't talk about where we share data, and so this is an opportunity for us to basically be reflexive on all those levels.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point you raise about, we study what is given to us, and I think there has been a bit in the early days of ICS Journal, for example, and many other social science journals, you could publish with a very descriptive overview of what's happening during an election campaign or a protest on Twitter. And I think this throttling comes at a time when there's probably a set of best practices that was being formed around that data, sort of relating to what you were talking about, Dr. Walker, where you look at, okay, how many links were shared, who was sharing those links, and even the filtering of those data sets into what we're looking at was starting to get maybe standardized. Do you think that's the case? At least in the elections research, I can think of some sort of, commonly reported descriptive statistics that are influenced exactly by what type of data we're getting.
I would say that one of the problems is that those descriptive statistics are a great place to start and a horrible place to stop. And the vast majority of this research stops at those descriptive statistics and doesn't move beyond that. And so one of the issues is, as an academic community and as working with policymakers and industry, how do we ensure that we're producing high quality research? How do we evaluate our own research? And to be honest, we failed at that. We're producing a lot of sort of dodgy research, and I mean, there's some great, amazing, high-quality research, and then there's two ends. Then the other end of the spectrum is there's this really poor quality research that stops at these descriptive statistics. Like, at some point, what does it mean that this candidate has more likes on Facebook than this candidate? That really means nothing. That doesn't tell us much. We need to take that to the next step, and we've published a lot of that research, and so now we can stop and say, okay, we've done that. Now, what's the next stage? How do we, one, train the next group of academics, and also how do we help our students in engineering and social science and social technologies and critical data studies? How do we help those students understand how to collaborate and produce better research in industry, so that all these sort of harms that are appearing on a daily basis, how do we mitigate those, and how do we be more thoughtful about that? So I would say that we don't have a set of standard practices yet, because I can read all these papers and I have no idea what they did.
Yeah, I guess that goes to the point of how the data is being reported on, and there's a lot of variability there, also from one journal to another, and in terms of different areas reporting on the data in different ways. But I guess one of the other things that was coming out of the conference was this appeal for more mixed methods research, right? So again, thinking outside the API box, if you want to call it that, and looking into potential irrigation, as Sean was putting it, of this data by other means, through survey research that in some ways is complementary to the API inquiries, or call it more qualitative research.
That'll be a good place to launch directly into the work that both of you have been doing, particularly on protests. And Dr. Walker, why don't we start with you? Because I think I know you've been working a lot with the Occupy Wall Street movement, and you've done a lot of work on that. And it's hard to summarize, I'm sure, in a short podcast. But, I think as an American, Occupy was one of the not the first protests, but at least in my lifetime, one of the biggest events around civic participation and getting people out in the streets. So can you kind of discuss what you were looking at with the Occupy movement, why you chose it, and what focus on digital, what does that bring into the study of protest movements?
Well, the interesting thing was, so around the Occupy movement, a colleague of mine, this is while I was getting my PhD at the University of Washington, and a colleague of mine, Jeff Hemsley, who's at Syracuse, he was doing his general exams and procrastinating slightly. And he was looking at this Occupy movement, this thing that he was seeing online. And then we brought in a geographer, and then we started collecting data. And one of the questions that I had was, how do we collect a data set that all three of us from these different perspectives of information science, from someone who's in economics and someone who's in geography, how do we collect a data set that all of us can use to study these problems? And so that's the core of this project that then turned into, basically I'm still using that data today since that started collecting in 2011. And one of the first projects that I worked on was about how Occupy is a different type of social movement. I mean, according to, contentious political theory, Occupy shouldn't have happened, because at the core of most political protests are these political organizations that provide this resource allocation function. Where should people go? Money, signs, all these sorts of things. And Occupy turned their back on those traditional organizations, and instead they use technology as that backbone to allocate those resources, to communicate between camps, and to do those sorts of things. To the work that I'm doing today, when we're looking at that to see about Russian infiltration of Occupy, and to see if Russia piloted some of the tactics they used in the 2016 election, we think they may have piloted some of those tactics in Occupy itself. So
really,
that also goes back to the why it's so important to preserve this data set, because this data set's a longitudinal data from Occupy from about a year and a half, and it's impossible to collect that data set again. I can't purchase that data set even if I had a credit card with an unlimited balance, right?
And so what type of data is it? Is it Facebook data, Twitter data, and kind of what are you looking at and poking around in that data?
So this data is Twitter data. Mainly, there's some web archives that are attached to that, and we poked around in doing network analysis. We've done coding of the URLs. So what types of resources does Occupy tweet out? Do members of Occupy tweet out at different moments in time? So basically, is Occupy acting like a networked organization? That's some earlier work with Lance Bennett, and the answer that we found was yes. So whenever police come into a camp, then they're tweeting out different types of information versus when they need food or socks, and so they're dynamically acting, responding to the external environment and external threats. To some of the work that I'm doing today with, I think you talked to Dr. Bastos previously, and we're looking at hyperpartisan news in elections, and so we're combining the collection of social media data around elections and then doing real-time web archiving of that content, those links, because within the first 48 to 72 hours, that's whenever the misinformation, that really hot misinformation disappears. So if we try to study a lot of this phenomena 72 hours or a month later, we're actually stepping into this drastically altered data set, because it's not just the conversation about are tweets still accessible, or a Facebook post still accessible, or Reddit post still accessible. It's also about all the metadata around that post changes. So a really good example of this is if you look at one of President Trump's early tweets. If you look in the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine, you'll see tweets pre-president as like a very golf course vibe. But if you look at that same tweet live in the site today, you have all the metadata about being president. So it looks like the president is tweeting that. And so the only hint that you have is that time and date stamp. So this sort of time travel is problematic. And then the other piece is these URLs. So these URLs disappear, they change, and they're inaccessible. And so what we're basically doing when we study this is we break the time bound, because a social media post is all of this content at a certain moment in time. And if we study these outside of that time, then we don't know if we're studying the same thing.
Yeah, and I think that it raises a really interesting point around this idea of looking at social media data longitudinally. As you were mentioning with Occupy, Dr. Mercea, we were talking about your bot network with Dr. Bastos as well, which also has that longitudinal aspect in terms of detecting these bots. But there's also going from time travel to space travel because of these digitally enabled connective action affordances of social media. Protests can sort of catch on in other places. And the Occupy movement was kind of replicated, as far as I understand, in different parts of Europe and around the world. So I want to get into this idea of transnational serial activists in a second. But first, Dr. Mercea, why don't you kind of give us an idea of how you're looking at social media and their connection to protest? I mean, you've done a lot of work in this area.
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea that I started from was to look at how social media are used in advance of collective action, of protest, to get a sense of whether that usage in any way primes, if you want, participation. And so that started my interest in the topic. And then together with Dr. Bastos, we had one paper where we were trying to establish a link between actions in preparation, if you want, or ahead of a protest event, and the actual events on site, on location. So, for instance, looking into how people were, this was the Indignados movement in Spain, and looking at how people were communicated about setting up a campsite in central Madrid on Twitter, and how that then resulted in the setting up of the campsite at that location. So that was the primary way, and of scaling up that initial research interest, which I was looking at with more qualitative data and on a smaller scale. And then from there, we took it on. We kind of snowballed it all the way to a kind of cross-national data set. We'd been collecting data associated with various protest events for roughly 4 years. So from 2009, the Moldovan revolution, then Iran, and so on, all the way up to the protest events in Brazil in the fall of 2013.
And that was something about sugar, wasn't it?
No, the vinegar protests. They were called the vinegar protests because that's what the protesters were using to try and kind of, they were basically being pepper sprayed, and that was like the antidote for the pepper spray.
Uh-huh.
So basically the data set that we ended up with was interesting to us because we were able to identify people that had been tweeting across a very large number of protest incidents, if you want, globally. And they had been doing that for a very long period of time. So what we then decided to do was to try and get in touch with these, we call them serial activists, because of the scope of their activity, of their tweeting, both in terms of the time that they had been doing it for and the geographical span. And we started talking to them, and we found out a number of very interesting things about them. First of all, and this is not a representative sample by any measure, but in terms of the people that we ended up talking to, most of them were female Twitter users. Again, this was a Twitter data set. I don't think I mentioned that previously. So this was they were female users. They were in their late 30s and all the way up to their 60s and 70s. And they were incredible in the way in which they were fitting their Twitter activity into their daily lives. So they were tweeting on their way to work. And then they were basically arranging or rearranging their everyday lives around the tweeting because of what they perceived was, the greater common interest in preserving democracy around the globe.
And it's fascinating. I have one of those papers in front of me, and I mean, first of all, big data, a lot of tweets collected. I have it here. Almost 20 million for these different protests. Was it 193 protests? And then you basically filtered it down to 200 most active individuals who tweeted with at least 43 and up to 101 protest hashtags.
That's right.
Meaning, so these people were really participating in all of these protests, and I guess it becomes part of their identity at some point. But what was in it for them? What was their motivation for engaging in these protests that might not really relate to them?
I think it was a very normative motivation they had, which was to try and preserve democracy, or at least give democracy a chance in places where that particular political setup hadn't been in place. And so that was I think that was the primary moral imperative for them. And what was also very interesting was, in terms of looking back at the literature, they were, so the literature in the 1990s was talking about rooted cosmopolitans as being the type of activist who's got a wide international social network, and they're being socialized into activism in that way. And these guys were not that. They didn't have the roots. They didn't have the social roots. And they were doing it pretty much on their own. So they may have been involved in activism previously, but not on that international scale, and not in that arena in any way. So that was quite interesting because they were not these rooted cosmopolitans of the 1990s. They were serial activists that were remotely involved in acts of collective action.
Mm. And Dr. Walker, did you notice any of that type of transnational participation in the Occupy movement in the States from your data set?
Well, yeah, so the Occupy data is international that we have, and camps spread internationally. And the other part that we saw that was very interesting is that there were connections to other movements. So we could see the tent movement in Israel. We could see different Occupy camps exchanging tactics, as well as the protests in Saudi Arabia. You could see these influence of tactic adaptation, which is a core part of contingent political theory, of how social movements change over time and evolve and adapt. But we saw this very quick adaptation where you see, Occupy in New York did this thing, the other camp started doing this thing, and then you see this similar tactic now appear in Saudi Arabia. And one of the other things I'd like to bring up is that you mentioned some really important methodological contributions and sort of exemplars in the paper from Marco and Dan, is that the importance of how they sifted through their data, the quality of their data. And then they also point to the problems with a lot of the work around how do we identify bots. And traditionally, we identify bots based on volume, and we're finding volume alone. These protesters violate all those rules of we just find a bot because a bot is someone that tweets a lot, and that's not true.
Yeah, and that's I have so many questions I want to ask, but what I really love about this serial activist project is you really kind of dig out some of the ways that activists are using these technologies in ways they weren't intended to be used. So, for example, you'd have one account. This is what you were just referring to, I think, Dr. Walker. You'd have one account that would be shared among different activists so they can log in. And I mean, we noticed from the campaigners we talked about, like for the European Parliament on Snapchat, they have one account, but it's shared by multiple people with multiple phones. So those activists were doing that and could be registered as bots if you have a bunch of people tweeting from the same organization. Question, though, about keeping this idea of the longitudinal aspect in mind. So both in the work that we've been talking about, the Occupy work and the serial activist work, this was before the sort of widespread adoption of peer-to-peer encrypted messaging apps like Telegram and WhatsApp, where we really can't get into that data at all. But I think is starting to play a more pivotal role in protests. I don't think WhatsApp was around during Occupy Wall Street, was it?
No.
Okay. So how do you think those type of apps are changing the game, or what do we know about how protesters are using them? And maybe a follow-up question for Dr. Walker, how would we go about studying them?
Well, so I want to say that this is not a new problem. I mean,
Okay.
is that in studying protests and boots on the ground, we've always had multiple channels of communication. We've had public channels, we've had back channels. And so now WhatsApp and other technologies, are part of those back channels. Email was part of those back channels. In-house meetings were part of those back channels. So part of, I think, something that infuriates me, if I can use strong language, about social media research is that we often approach this as if this is a new phenomenon, and this is actually just a slight twist on something that's always been happening. And so how do we go back to how have we studied this in the past? This is, so going back to traditional methods like Dan was saying about interviews and surveys and combining that. So this is not new. It's just this is a different twist. This back channel communication is moved from in-house meetings and email listservs to now using WhatsApp and Telegram and Signal and other sorts of tools.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, one of the fascinating things is that we barely scratched the surface of those interviews. And so one of the claims that we heard many of our interviews make was that Twitter, in the case of our study, was used as the front stage, if you want, of the movement, and it was used for very public purposes. And they were fully aware of the constraints that came with using the platform. They were talking, for instance, about Twitter jail as being one consequence of them posting so profusely. And then that was the front stage, as my colleague Emiliano Trene would put it, and he did use this term in an article. And so that was the front stage, Twitter was, and then the backstage was the place where they were using other messaging services that were in use at the time to coordinate, for instance, when it came to more delicate issues, for instance, trying to get diplomatic response to the shutting down of the internet in Egypt, right? At the time of the protests in Tahrir Square. So, they claimed, some of these interviews claimed that they were instrumental in getting then people on Twitter to then post to embassies around the world to get them to pressurize the Egyptian government to turn the internet back on. So that front stage, backstage dynamic is something that we picked up on. And I think it's probably where the research that we're kind of hearing about now in relation to services such as WhatsApp, Telegram, and so on, where that research is kind of going.
And how pivotal do you think or impactful is this sort of transnational element or getting the outside help in terms of the sharing of best practices for Occupy and similar movements, or in terms of having someone like sitting from their computer in France but is participating in a protest in, the Middle East somewhere? I mean, what does that afford, basically?
So I would say what's really important in a protest is if no one's paying attention, then there is no protest. And so this attention, this listening is an essential component and is not a form of just slacktivism. This is what's required to nourish and grow movement. So you have, this complex combination of, boots on the ground, so to speak, and boots online and attention, and then helping that to get into the media. So it's this combination of all of these layers that come together. That are really essential. So I wouldn't discount the importance of attention. And I think we often do. And part of that, especially within these digitally enabled protests, is that we only get metrics about production from the platforms, because that's what makes the platforms money. And that's the metric that they calculate for us. So we focus on production instead of listening and observation. And that's also an essential form of participation.
I guess there's an element of social reinforcement, if you want to call it that. There's power in numbers, and we know that through research. And so, having a sense of where, your idea is going, whether your challenge to a political regime finds any support, and kind of, rolling things down from that point, I think that is an incentive to use these platforms in a public way. Of course, there is a downside, and there are many caveats that come with that usage. But I suppose, having that social perspective on things is important, when you're thinking about scaling protests up.
And to address your question around data, there's actually a lot of data still there. Just because we don't have the content of these individual messages from these platforms, the platforms have the metadata. So platforms have access to who's communicating, when they're communicating, how often they're communicating, and there are lots of examples using cell phone network data. For example, Josh Blumenstock at the Berkeley I School has done work in this area. So there actually is data that the platforms could give us that isn't the actual content of the messages that we could then use to understand protest, understand spread of information, understand communication patterns. So there's still data there. Don't be under the misimpression that there's nothing to study. It's just we can't get access to the messages, but there's a whole lot we can do with the other types of data, which also brings in another sort of privacy concern too.
Yeah, and I think just as communication scholars, the tradition in that field has generally been to look at content and to look at whether it's framing of messages or mentions of certain politicians over the other. So I think we carry that content focus into it. So it's a really interesting point to start thinking broader about what metadata can actually be used.
Well, and my background's in information science, so I'm an honorary, maybe political communication scholar in a way. And so, library schools, information schools, other fields, looking at the network analyses and understanding that. And that also is why, this one field alone can't answer these questions. That's why interdisciplinary work, not sort of in the sense that universities say that they're interdisciplinary, but actual interdisciplinary work are the only ways that we can address these questions, because we need the theoretical expertise, data expertise, and all that has to come together and impact each other and make changes. And so that's the only way. And that was one of the things that was great about the symposium here, is that we had scholars from across a range of disciplines that came together to discuss this, and some scholars that have never done qualitative work in their life, and some scholars that have never done quantitative work in their life, and some scholars that have done everything in between. And that's what it's going to take to address a lot of these problems.
Yeah, and I would just add that one of the things that came out of the symposium, one of the main ideas was we need to think about the users, to put the user back in the picture in some ways, and think about obviously their interests, their concerns to do with privacy, for instance, but also about how fundamentally we want to understand the users. Many of us in sociology, political science, and so on, who don't necessarily have a primary interest in understanding how the platforms work and also with the vital work that Sean does, looking at how platforms evolve, right? How their API, for instance, evolves over time and constantly is being updated. So I think keeping the user in focus is also a way of ensuring that we are regarded as responsible, responsible academics, responsible researchers that always have the interest of the user at heart, right? So I mean, going back to where we started from, what we were saying at the start of the interview, the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the idea that the Cambridge academic kind of misused the data that he was collecting through a Facebook application. That's something that triggered or exacerbated concerns to do with privacy on Facebook. I was just reading up ahead of the interview now. I was reading up on his account of what had happened, and he's basically claiming that it was all above board, and the application was in fact a commercial application, and Facebook signed off on its usage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that that this whole scandal started from academia, right, with a researcher. But yeah, I mean, and we also talked a bit during the conference about, how enforceable are these terms of service of the platforms, and there isn't any legal precedent for a platform suing a researcher or university. But I'm pretty sure if there was going to be one, the Cambridge Analytica scandal would be a good place to start. So if there hasn't been a suit yet, then there's probably, some reasons for that.
Universities, archives are risk-averse institutions. And so we have multiple examples of these institutions and individual researchers receiving cease and desist letters. And then universities are like, no, we're not going to pay for this, so you have to take down that data. And so that's one of the reasons why it hasn't gotten to that point. So and I think we also need to understand what are user expectations and what is a user's understanding of how their data is used in the platform. So we have no tool. We don't have any tools for consent, which is sort of also problematic to solely focus on consent. But we don't, even more problematic, we don't have tools to notify users. And so if you think of the work of Nick Preferis, who's at the University of Kentucky, that was at the conference, has done a lot of work interviewing users of what's your understanding of how your data is used? How would you like to be notified? Would you like to know? Would you like to be able to click a button that says, here's what studies you've been in and here's how you can contact those researchers? So it's not just about asking for permission. It's also saying, here's what we've done. Here's how we've used your data. Here's how you can interact with us and have a conversation. So there are multiple levels of this problem.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. This probably would be a good place to bring it home, but I'm not done yet. I have a few more questions for you that relate to this difference. It's something I'm very curious to get your take on. The difference between civic and political engagement or civic and political participation. That's kind of a bit of a gray zone. What's the difference between engagement, participation, et cetera? But what distinguishes, generally we think of civic engagement as social movements, protests, extra-parliamentary activity, and political engagement as something that happens in the formal electoral realm, but they can often be the same activity. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that difference or similarity of those two terms, civic and political engagement.
Well, I suppose, intellectually it's an interesting question. I'm not sure that many people that actually are involved in acts of civic participation would regard themselves as not being politically active as well. So I mean, this takes me back to research done on young citizens in the US, for instance, where the kind of understanding that emerged from that research was that you have young people who are civically active. And through that process, by way of socialization into certain types of action and by picking up ideas about what it means to be a good citizen, they end up also being politically active by voting or being involved in politics in other ways, for instance, campaigning. So I think this is, in practice, this might be a tenuous distinction. I think it's important to make this distinction primarily because we see that political participation is on the wane, or it has been, although there've been ups and downs, peaks and troughs. And so I guess the interest then was to see whether that habit of being politically active has kind of mutated into civic participation, maybe, right? And the insights, certainly when looking at young people, the insights that we've seen suggests that actually young people are, they're civically active, and that is a precursor, if you want. It's a stepping stone, if you want, to political participation.
I think these waters are pretty muddy in the sense, traditionally we've thought, of this space as, voting and then there's everything else. And but that's not the conception of, as Dan was saying, this is changing as this technology is enmeshed and integrated into our lives. So I think part of this is how do we reimagine what political participation and what civic engagement is.
Yeah, well, I'm curious because that's what I'm writing my thesis on. So I wanted to get a little feedback from you guys. Maybe I'll cite you in there.
You should.
Dr. Walker, second part, this was actually a two-step question because I'm curious. We've been talking a lot about these very academic questions, but we're recording about a week away from the midterms, and the sort of hype around the midterms and what the media has been sort of reporting about is this blue wave, right? The blue wave, will it happen? Will it not? And that, just for our listeners who are maybe outside of the U.S., it's the idea that the Democrats will turn out, they're mobilized in a sort of anti-Trump fashion to come out and vote. And that, I think, gets to this idea of civic versus political participation, because Occupy was a very civic movement. And I think the blue wave is somehow attached to that tradition of Democrats and mobilizing. I mean, do you see the blue wave in any way connected to the Occupy movement as a form of kind of civic participation that might bleed over into political participation?
Well, so I think a sort of precursor question maybe is what impact did Occupy actually have? Mm-hmm. And so some scholars and some non-scholars, right? Normal people, would that be fair to say? So would say that Occupy fizzled out and nothing happened. But if you look at the Occupy movement, they changed the conversation during the presidential debates during that time. Inequality came up in the presidential debates, and that happened because of Occupy. So there are all these multiple effects. Just because there's no Occupy party anymore doesn't mean that Occupy didn't have an effect. And also Occupy has this lasting effect on how do we construct and form social movements. So I think these are hard to measure. And this morning I was looking at the sort of red wave hashtags. And so on both sides, there's this conversation of, all of these events that are happening are going to push this red wave, and then all of these events are going to push this blue wave. And so it's indeterminate what the impact is going to be. But what's changing, I think, is a conversation, which is an unsatisfying answer right now, I think. And I also think we need to do a better job of figuring out, how do we measure and understand impact? How do we understand the relationship between what's happening online and what's happening, in the voting booth, and how do we connect that together? Because right now that research is very disconnected. So it's sort of unsatisfying.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and it's very tricky to measure cultural transmission and transformation. That's because we're essentially talking about a cultural shift that's maybe started or was, going on even before Occupy, and then Occupy was a key moment, if you want, in this political transformation or move. And then, we're still going, I suppose. In some ways, we're still going. And this is something that is incredibly difficult to pin down. And we see that in conversations about social movements in academia,
Definitely. And I think that's what the challenges are going forward in this locked out climate that we're in. But I know y'all both have planes to catch. So thank you so much, Dr. Mercea, Dr. Walker, for taking the time out. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
I've just been speaking with Drs. Dan Mercea and Sean Walker. Dr. Mercea is a senior lecturer in sociology at City, University of London, and Dr. Sean Walker is an assistant professor in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University. That'll do it for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. As ever, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.